Good evening, everybody, and welcome. This is the fourth day of the fourth International Conference on Freedom of the Press. Our next session is under Outstanding Journalistic Projects, and it is a great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Heather Murdock, from Voice of America. Ms. Murdock has been a field journalist for over 10 years in the Middle East and Africa, producing breaking news, text and video features, radio reports, and documentaries. Currently, she is the refugee correspondent for the Voice of America and has previously reported for dozens of other newspapers, magazines, and broadcast companies. Heather Murdock has won the Online Journalism Award in Digital Storytelling category for 2020. She will present Shura, a documentary from Voice of America News that explores a town torn between victims and Islamic State and families of IS members and coming to terms with the past. Heather, the floor is yours, and if anybody from our audience have any question, you are most welcome to use the chat.
Thank you so much. As you said, I'm here to present and talk about a bit about my documentary, Shura, which is a town in northern Iraq. And to start with, I wanted to show you a little bit of the introduction because I think it better explains why we found this town so fascinating that we wanted to make a documentary about it. With animation and graphics, and that happens throughout the documentary, and I'll talk a little bit more later about why we chose to do it that way.
This is the story of a town deep in the Iraqi desert, a story of violence, vengeance, and the seemingly impossible task of reconciliation. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, provoking an insurgency. Over the next decade, the most extreme fighters evolved into the Islamic State group. IS forces took over large parts of Iraq and Syria. Their leader declared a caliphate. This town was home to several leading militants, and roughly half the men here swore allegiance to the group. Their will was imposed on all. In 2016, a counteroffensive began pushing IS out. Now in this town, the families of the defeated militants live side by side with the families of the victims. This town is Shura.
الدراسة كل شيء راحت دراستي كان السعانة نجاح حقيقي كان السعانة الأول مرحلة أولى
بطلنا المدرسة بطلنا ما مسوي قاعدين بالبيت وساكتين
بس بعدين واكم مدارس صارت كلها تلاوة عشان نقول يعني تدريس ما معترف به صارت يعني تلبس زي واحد لازم اللي هو عندها عريض يجي مثل طالب ابتدائي مو واحد زائد واحد طلقة زائد طلقة ما اعرف شنو يتعلمون على السوالف هاي يعني الشتل ما اعرف شنو هاي هي المدارس هذا انه ما حد قابل ودي الطلاب على المدارس.
So, when we first went to Shura, it had been about 2 years that I had been in Iraq and Syria, but more in Iraq at that time, covering the fight with Islamic State militants. At the time, I was traveling with our field producer, Halan Sheikha, who was actually the first person to go to Shura. It was strange. We had been working in Mosul province and the city for a long time before we ever heard of it. But once we did hear about it, we learned that this town was a little bit famous, or rather infamous, because some of the leading IS militants came from Shura. Anyway, Halan went to Shura with another a group of researchers for something else and came back and said, this place is special. We need to go there and do a proper story about it. What was different about the town is that unlike most of Iraq and Syria, where IS militants had mostly been defeated in Iraq and partially in Syria, the people in Shura were trying to reconcile, whereas the people in other parts of the country were separated. The families of the militants tended, and still to this day, live in camps often. And these are desert, unpleasant camps, often closed camps where they cannot leave. So in some ways like prisons, whereas the other families went home. So once the fighting had stopped and this situation had developed, we started to look at some problems with our coverage in general and reevaluate what we were doing and what we thought would be useful going forward. One thing that was true about the coverage of the fight against Islamic State militants is that there was a general narrative in the media, including my own, that it was good guys against bad guys. We presented the militants like a monolith of evil, as opposed to a complex group of people. And there's reasons for this. I mean, first of all, the militants presented themselves that way. They put out horrible videos where they committed gross acts of violence and then bragged about it. But there were other reasons as well. We were also physically covering the war from one side. We were literally with the Iraqi or the Syrian soldiers behind their guns on the front lines with the ISIS guns pointed at us. So there is a tendency to naturally sympathize with the side that you're physically on. But the last thing that happened is that usually in a war, it's hard to write about the sides because it's not a good guy side and a bad guy side. It's two sides fighting with each other, and as impartial journalists, we're supposed to cover them equally. This was not the case. It was actually in some ways easier to cover ISIS than other wars I've covered because there was a clear hero and a clear enemy. And for example, when I write about other wars, sometimes if it's good, I expect that both sides are offended by my work because I presented the other side's point of view. Anyway, once a lot of the area that ISIS once held was retaken by the government, what we wanted to do was find out who these people really were and try to present them more as a complex group of human beings and less as a group of just bad guys. And what we found was in the camps where a lot of people were living, people weren't becoming less extreme. They were becoming more extreme. They weren't becoming less angry at the system, systemic failures that led to ISIS developing in the first place. They were more angry. There was children, lots and lots of children there are children growing up in these camps, and all they know about their fathers is that they're either dead or in jail or missing, and that the government they know, which is essentially whichever group of soldiers is controlling their camp, considers their fathers terrorists. One of the saddest things I think I've ever seen is children of Islamic State militants in camps accusing or threatening to kill a photographer, a Brazilian photographer I was with at the time. And it was just so sad. They were kids and they were laughing, but you know, these children don't have any place to go if something doesn't change because they'll never be accepted in outside society. So is that their only possible future is to be an extremist and to try to kill infidels? Anyway, this is where Shura comes in. Shura is different. As I said, they're trying to live together and trying to reconcile, and it's complicated, but it's the attempt itself that originally made us interested. We decided to do this documentary with graphic art and video for a couple of reasons. The first is just that we like art, and Brian Williamson, the artist, he likes to say his specialty is doodling really sad things, and this was right up his alley. Also, we were shooting the documentary in the summer, and so it was 45 or 50 degrees every day, and people just didn't move around a lot. So there wasn't a lot to video. And then the last thing, and most important reason why we decided to do the graphic art is because we wanted to tell the stories of things that happened before we got there and make them visual and make them clear and understandable. So the next clip I'm going to show you is of Omar. And Omar is a man who, one of his brothers was a member of ISIS. And another one of his brothers was killed by ISIS members. And now he supports all of their children. So he supports 9 people on his salary from working at a small shop and in a government office. Anyway, I'll let him tell you what happened to him.
In some cases, IS tricked family members into helping the group kill.
أعمل موظف بالبلدية واشتغل خارج الدوام محل مع الحلويات ياخذون سلاح من التنظر يبيعون من عندهم ترى يعني سري هذا الشغله فعاد قبضوا واحد من الموصل اعترف على من الحمام وجوا خذوه جت الأمنية خذوني ورحنا على بيته بس ما قالوا لي إنه يعني هيك شغلات قالوا أخوك عابر على الحشد يعني هيك بأسلوب قلت لهم أخوي موجود وأنا ما أدري يعني بأنه هذا ولا نفوت على البيت من وصلنا قادش ثاني يوم جوا خذوا سيارته وهذا اليوم ما شفناه.
So that's Omar. Another thing that we struggled with when we were trying to design this documentary was how to show the depth of the horribleness that people went through without making the documentary itself traumatic to watch. One of the things we did use, and we tried not to use a lot of it, but we did use ISIS propaganda video in places to try to show what it looked like inside the so-called caliphate. We tried to mitigate the use of this by using just bits that weren't violent. That was our basic principle, and not using any more than we felt like we really needed to. But the next clip I'm going to show you is the one exception where we used some violent video. It's about a couple, a man and wife that prefer to be called Wassam and Abu Wassam, and their son, Wassam, who was killed by ISIS. And he appeared in one of the most horrific videos that ISIS let out. When we met them, I had not seen this video. I later learned that it was widely spread out, but at the time I hadn't seen it. It was just a random house. We knocked on the door and said, "Hi, we're journalists and we'd like to ask you about your life here and life during the war and under ISIS." And they were like, "Yes, come in," like they were expecting us. And they started telling us the story of their son. And they brought, Abu Wassam brought out his phone and showed us this horrible video of his son being murdered. And he told us later that he was expecting us for years even. He was, after Wassam was killed, and that happened in 2015, so this is years later, no government person or NGO or journalist or anybody came to the house to ask how they were doing, and he thought that was strange until we finally did come. So I'm going to show you this next video about, and you can see how we chose to use some of the ISIS video and chose not to use others. We talked a lot about this in terms of the ethics of using it and how much, and I'll let you decide for yourself if we did okay.
These are the parents of a young man named Wassam.
18/5/2015 يوم الاثنين
فتش الفراش الكمدينات القناصير ما لقى قلت له لا لقيت سنكرت لا لقيت جقاره هم يطلع عقله من
ليش اخذوه يعني بحجه انه يعني يوصل معلومات للقوات الامنيه ويعني على اساس جاسوس. هذا الفيديو ماله، الفيديو هذا من التصوير من اعدموه.
هذا الفيديو؟
والله سحبته من الجماعه الناشرين اللي كانوا حافظينه، وحتى هذول الجماعه ما كل حرقون بالقفص ويا موجود هذا الفيديو جماعه القفص.
فنحن وإن جار زمان لبرهة نبقى الكبار.
ما شفت، بس شفت صورته من يسولف، بس هاي شفته. قبل فترة هم شفته، يعني صورته ولا ما شفته؟ ما شفته.
So I guess probably everyone will agree that's pretty horrible. I can't even begin to imagine how horrible that is for Abu Wassam and Wassam to have this video in their phones of the worst thing that ever happened to them. Anyway, this brings us to the main theme of the documentary, which is reconciliation. And I know this, the theme of this conference has also been about polarized societies. So I just wanted to point out, there's no town that you're going to find that's more polarized than Shora. Like I talk about it like a place that's having a reconciliation, but it's also a place that was torn apart. It's a very small town, about 1,400 people, 1,400 men. About 700 of them joined ISIS. And I think to the person, every single one is gone now, mostly killed in battle or in jail, but some disappeared. There's a sheikh in Shora, Sheikh Shabori, who he's kind of like the unofficial mayor. They have a mayor, but the sheikh kind of runs stuff too. And he has a mantra. He says, our children are going to go to school with the children of ISIS fighters. They will all grow up together, and therefore they will be able to live in peace together in the future. And this sheikh has also done some extraordinary things in terms of trying to make this happen. He's not the only one who's doing it, but it's not very many people who are doing stuff like this. First, let me just tell you a little background of how it kind of worked at the time. During the war, the basic pattern of events was when the Iraqi forces and coalition forces got close to a town or a neighborhood held by Islamic State militants. First, the coalition would bomb the area. The civilians, anyone who could, would run out, and then there'd be ground fighting. That was sort of the basic pattern, and the same thing happened in Shora. The bombing began, the civilians all led, the children of ISIS fighters and non-ISIS fighters all fled together. But then when the battle was over, like in most places, the families that were not involved in the militancy went home. Once the government had control of the area, they went home to try to rebuild after the battle. The families of the ISIS fighters stayed in the camps, as many do. What the sheikh did was he went to the camps and he brought all of these families back. He had help. He had help from actually from prominent people in northern Iraq who would actually rather not be mentioned in this or in any other way in about their effort to reunite this town because they don't want to be seen as pro-ISIS. They brought all the families back except for a couple of families that were the wives and children of the most prominent, infamous ISIS militants. We went to the camp, we met those ladies, and they couldn't come back as far as they know because they think they'd be in danger. And while they wouldn't tell us exactly what their husbands did, people in Shora were pretty traumatized by some of their actions. So not all, but most. And then what they did was an attempt at having a reconciliation. They would bring ISIS families and non-ISIS families, and I know this term sounds strange, ISIS, non-ISIS, but that's how they explain it, together and talk about how they can live next to each other and put the past violence behind them. This, of course, is not a perfect system. I mean, people in Shora, a lot of them don't like each other. A lot of them don't trust each other. A lot of them are victims of the violence that ISIS did, and a lot of them are perpetrators or at least complicit. But what is the alternative? The most famous reconciliation, which had some of the greatest minds in the world on it, was of course in South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And while that process also was not perfect, but I think historically we've deemed that a success. Reconciliation is better than not reconciliation, even if it's not perfect and even if it doesn't work 100%. And for people like the Sheikh, he sees it as the only possible way to build a future for Shura, for Iraq in general. Some people in Shura are less positive that this could work in other places. They do say that perhaps the reason why it can work there is because it's a small town isolated in the desert, and they are all in some way related to each other. So perhaps they can forget about past battles because of this closeness. However, again, the alternative is what we're seeing in the places where there is no effort to reconcile. For example, in Iraq, just today, there's an effort going on to try to bring 100 families from the Al-Hol camp in Syria to Iraq. And these are Iraqi families that were among the people that fled the battle at the very end, the very last battle with Islamic State militants' official territory was in a town called Baghouz in Syria. And an unbelievable amount of people were in Baghouz, and many of them had been retreating with ISIS militants all the way from Mosul. So they had gone from Iraq to Syria, from town to town to town, retreating until finally they fled the town in the middle of a battle and ended up in Al-Hol camp. Among these families, you will find the most extreme of the extremists, but you'll also find people who are not. It's impossible to tell unless they tell you how they feel. And a lot of the extremists are happy to do so. A lot of the children will openly say they're planning to grow up to be militants themselves and avenge their fathers, and they train. These families, these 100 families, I don't know who they are, but presumably they are not among the extreme of the extremists. They are Iraqis. The Iraqi government wants to bring them back, put them in this new camp that they're building in Mosul province. And it's facing a lot of opposition, including members of parliament who have said this is a disaster. And I don't know exactly what's happening, because it's happening now, but I did hear today some of the cars that they sent to Syria to pick up these families came back empty, and that they didn't bring them. And of course, everyone can understand why people in Mosul don't want the families of militants to come back. I mean, the amount they've suffered through foreign invasions and militancy that in many ways grew out of the foreign invasions, it's so extreme, they would be stupid not to fear a return to this. So there's that objection, and you can understand why it's very hard for people to even live next to each other in order to try to reconcile, which is what makes Shura pretty extraordinary. But the other thing is, it's not necessarily guaranteed even there that it will work. The last person I'm going to show you is a boy named Zinedine. Zinedine was is teenager in Shura, and he is in the documentary, kind of like a guide for the viewer, but he was also in our summer in Shura, a guide for us. We all became friends. And Zinedine, when we first met him, he talks a lot, similarly to the Sheikh, where he would say, yes, we believe that our children will go to school with the children of ISIS and will be educated together, and we can live together in the future in peace. But as we got to know him better, he had more nuanced opinions that he shared, and he also there was also an attack on his family in the countryside outside of Shura, and threats against him particularly. And I'll let him tell you how he feels about it now.
Shura is surrounded by desert, and militants still stage attacks in the nearby villages.
طبوا عليهم دواعش بال11:30 بالليل. قتلوا ولد 2 نفذوا بين إصدار نشروا صورهم، يعني تا يقولون احنا موجودين يرعبون العالم تا يخلون العالم تبطل. وهسه احنا خاصة الشورى احنا مهددة كثير، لكن يوم بالتعليقات هددونا. أنا من الناس قال انطيني عنوانك واسمك الثلاثي، لكن حتى أشوفك بالموبايل عنوانك واسمك الثلاثي وأنا عنك. أعطيت عنوان اسمه الثلاثي قلت له تعال. اسمي شنو يعني؟ هو عنده سلاح وانا عندنا سلاح. أول شيء الكل انطلبت شبير وزقير، اللي عنده شيء واللي ما عنده شيء، الموظف والعسكري وهاي كلها انطلبت، فما يخوف شلبي. خلي يجي، هو عنده سلاح وانا عندنا سلاح، خلي يجي.
خلي يجي.
خلي يجي.
ليش؟
يتعنيش عرب. معلش ليش؟ تهري نقتلهم. احنا كيف اذا يجون؟ كيف اذا يجي واحد ونقتله ونفتخر بهذا الشيء؟
So that's my presentation. If you want to see the whole documentary, it's on our website, voanews.com. And we also have several projects by myself and Brian Williamson that mix art and reporting, and mostly about refugees and refugee issues. I was told there may or may not be questions, so if there are, let me know.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much, and I really, really recommend everybody to log in and to watch this documentary of 30-something minutes, right? If I'm correct. I have millions of questions. We have short time, so I'll start by asking you, if I understood you correctly, the mix between the animation and the documentary footage was meant to address three challenges. First is lack of footage from the past. The second is not to show the too much violent footage from the present or from the past. And the third is to make it very accessible for viewers around the world to understand the complexity of the situation and realities on the ground, right?
Yes. I mean, and then there was also just the purely practical question of that we just liked it. We find it more compelling and more interesting,
and it conveys the message really, really beautifully.
Right. In this case, we can have, instead of watching Omar, and there's a few characters in this documentary that tell their stories. It's like, instead of watching them tell us a story, we can watch a version of the story.
Right. How did you gain their trust? I mean, coming from the outside, being foreigners, how did you gain the trust so they were open to you and speak their stories?
Well, partially it wasn't, like actually even just getting to Shora is tricky. It's along a road that's long been held by, before ISIS, it was held by Al-Qaeda. So even just getting permission to go there required us to have the trust of the general of the region. The people themselves, they trusted us pretty quickly because the Sheikh trusted us, and we gained his trust by going, before we ever started filming the documentary, we went to Shora several times and spent quite a bit of time with the Sheikh trying to understand it, understand him, and make sure he was on board. And then when we started working on our own, he didn't actually come around with us or follow us or seem to be even all that interested in what we did when we were not with him particularly. But I think it kind of came to be known in the town that people thought we were okay. And not everybody trusted us. There was one person that we interviewed that I think he thought he had to do the interview. Everyone else was very clear on this because of course we always say that. And then when we went back to interview him again, he like ran away, like he was afraid to be interviewed, which is fair enough. You know, there's lots of reasons to be afraid if you live in this town that has gone through so much violence. But So it was that, and then it's just time, you know. If you sit with people and hang out with people for long enough, eventually they stop finding you strange and too different.
Did you move into the, I mean, did you live there long?
Well, we lived actually for the summer. We spent the summer in Mosul, which is about an hour and a half away, the city of Mosul. And we would drive to Shora every day. We were told, and certainly the military there believed Shora to be very dangerous because of its long history with militancy. We wanted to sleep in Shora, and probably one of the families, for sure one of the families would have let us sleep in their living room. But we constantly redid our security assessment, and we couldn't figure out if it was safe to sleep there or not. So we ended up just driving back to Mosul every night.
And did you meet with any threats along the way? I mean, while being there and working there, I mean, did people threat you, or were you in any kind of danger, except from, you know, the general danger of being there?
No, there was one funny story where we were driving back from Shora, which is on the desert road, and an army car was behind us honking. We thought the army car wanted to pass, so we let them pass. They passed, and then an hour later, we get to the checkpoint in Mosul, and they're there waiting for us, and yes, shouting at us, saying, you know, you're supposed to stop when an army car wants you to stop. And we're like, oh, sorry, you know, here's our permits. We thought you wanted to pass, blah, blah. And then they said, actually, no, it's fine. You know what? Don't stop for anybody in that area. We could have been ISIS soldiers wearing Iraqi uniforms. You don't know. It happens a lot. So don't stop. And then they gave us their business card and said if we wanted to go on an operation with them, we could come. There's a considerable amount of danger operating in that area. There's mines. There's lots of mines. There's still militants in lots of places. And we were told it was very dangerous, but I didn't actually get threatened or hurt in any way while I was there. So maybe we were lucky, or maybe it wasn't as dangerous as we were told.
Who knows? Were there any gender issues?
Well, I mean, there's always gender issues operating in very conservative areas that are not used to seeing women walking around as boss. But I feel like, at least in this part of northern Iraq, they see a Western woman as so foreign that it's almost not applicable to compare me wearing jeans and being a journalist traveling to their daughters who they expect to stay at home and not go out, sometimes even without an escort. So, so yes and no. It's almost like I'm an alien sometimes to some people. It was funny though. The other thing that would happen was that when we would walk into the room, always there's the photographer, Felipe Pavia. Always people would start addressing him and offering him a seat because it was always assumed that he was the director. And this, of course, didn't make him very comfortable because he wanted people to leave him alone and let him shoot. Anyway, that was about it.
And my last question, did they watch the film? I mean, and what did they say about it? I mean, how did they like it?
In Shora, I don't know if the Sheikh watched the film or not. In fact, he's perfectly, we're still in touch, but he never asked about it. And Halan, our producer, said, if he doesn't ask for the film, why send it to him? What if he doesn't like it? I actually think he'll like it very much. But Zinedine did watch it, I know that, and some other of the people in the documentary watched it. And I think, especially for Zinedine, he found it fun to be like in a film.
Yes, a screening on site.
Pardon?
You didn't do a screening on site. You didn't go and show it to all the village.
No, we didn't go and do a screening on site. In fact, I'm not sure if we could get into Shora, at least when we finished our video, like our actual work there, and we went back a few times. The last time we were there, the army was told us that we were not allowed in Shora without a escort anymore. And that was partially because the army in Iraq rotates. So it was a different group than it had been there for the 6 months prior. But we didn't go back and do a screening. We just know that some of the people saw it, and Zinedine saw it because they told us on the phone.
All right. I want to really thank you for being with us and introducing your amazing project. And it's so inspiring. Thank you so much, Heather Murdock.
Thank you. And you made me think next time in Iraq, maybe I should go to Shora and do a screening of this video. I hadn't thought of that. Thanks.